You open your eyes. The first thing you notice is the smell. It hits you before anything else. Before the noise, before the light, before the full cognitive weight of where you are has finished loading. It is a smell of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary unpleasantness, wood smoke and animal dung and fish sauce and unwashed bodies and something else underneath all of it, something foundational, something that after a moment of horrified analysis, you identify as the collective sanitation output of approximately 1 million people living in very close proximity. You are in Rome, the real Rome, not the Rome of the movies, with its gleaming marble and its dignified senators in pristine togas making thoughtful speeches about republic and virtue. The actual Rome, the Rome of the year, let's say, 100 AD, the reign of the Emperor Trajan, which historians generally consider one of the high points of Roman civilization, which tells you something important about what the low points must have been like. The city around you is doing what it does at dawn, which is everything simultaneously at maximum volume. Carts are rumbling over stone streets. They were banned from the city center during daylight hours to reduce congestion, which means they all operate at night, which means the city that is quieter during the day was essentially a continuous cart traffic jam from dusk to dawn, and the noise this produced was a consistent subject of complaint in Roman literature. Vendors are setting up their stalls. Someone nearby is having an argument, in Latin, at a volume that suggests the argument has been going on for some time and is not approaching resolution. A rooster is crowing somewhere above you. A dog is barking somewhere below. Water is running. Rome had an extraordinary system of aqueducts, delivering fresh water continuously to the city's fountains and bathhouses, and the sound of running water was a constant background element of Roman urban soundscape. You take all of this in. You are standing in a street. A narrow street, much narrower than you expected. The buildings on either side rising 4 and 5 and 6 stories above your head, cutting off most of the sky. The street surface beneath your feet is paved with large, irregular stones, worn smooth by generations of feet and wheels, with a channel running down the center for drainage purposes. The channel is currently serving its drainage purpose. You should probably not be standing in the channel. Here's the thing about ancient Rome that you need to understand immediately, before anything else, before you make a single decision about how to navigate this city. It was trying to kill you. Not personally. It wasn't specifically targeting you. It was an equal opportunity threat environment, hazardous to everyone regardless of origin, status, or prior experience of difficult urban environments. Rome was the largest, most complex, most densely populated city in the Western world, and it had developed the specific set of dangers that come with being the largest, most complex, most densely populated city in the Western world, without having developed the specific set of protections that modern cities have developed in response to those same dangers. No traffic signals, no food safety regulations with enforcement, no germ theory, no building codes backed by structural engineering, no police force in any meaningful sense, no sewage treatment, no antibiotics, no guaranteed legal protections for anyone below a specific social status, and no Yelp reviews to warn you which street food vendor is going to give you the gastrointestinal experience of your life. What Rome did have was civilization. Genuine, sophisticated, impressive civilization. The aqueducts, the roads, the legal system, the literature, the engineering, the philosophical tradition, the administrative machinery that governed an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Rome was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily advanced, and it will still kill you, because extraordinarily advanced by the standards of 100 AD and survivable by a modern person dropped into it with no preparation are not the same thing, and the distance between them is the subject of this video. We are going to walk you through a day in ancient Rome. A single day from the moment you wake up to the moment you either go to sleep or don't, depending on how the day goes. We are going to look at the streets, the food, the social landscape, the legal system, the medicine, the the entertainment, and the general ambient danger of daily Roman life. We are going to explain, with specificity and with something approaching fondness for the sheer audacity of the thing, exactly how and why each element of this day presents a threat to your continued existence. By the end of this, you will have a profound new appreciation for building codes. You will feel differently about food, safety regulations. You will understand why running water is not a thing to take for granted, and you will have a clearer picture of what it actually meant to live in the city that for several centuries ruled the Western world. Let's start where all Roman days start, in the street. Chapter 1. The city that would kill you before breakfast. Rome's streets and infrastructure. Let's begin with the basics. You need to get from where you are. Let's say you've appeared in one of Rome's residential neighborhoods, in a narrow street off one of the main roads, surrounded by the tall apartment buildings the Romans called insulae, to somewhere else, anywhere else. You want to move through this city, see how it works, figure out how to survive in it. You will not make it to breakfast without encountering your first serious hazard, possibly your first several. The insulae, the word means islands, a poetic description of the way these multi-story apartment blocks rose from the street like landmasses in the flow of the city, were one of Rome's great architectural achievements and one of its great ongoing disasters. They solved the problem of housing 1 million people in a relatively compact urban space through the obvious mechanism of stacking people vertically, and by the imperial period, they had reached heights of 4, 5, 6, and in some cases, reportedly more stories. Rome had height limits on insulae. The Emperor Augustus set a limit of 70 feet, later reduced by Trajan to 60 feet, which tells you that before these limits were established, buildings were going higher than this, which in the context of Roman construction technology should make you nervous. Roman construction technology was genuinely impressive by ancient standards. The Romans invented concrete, or rather they developed a form of hydraulic concrete using volcanic ash called pozzolana that was remarkably strong, waterproof, and durable. Roman concrete structures have lasted 2,000 years. The Pantheon's concrete dome is still standing. The aqueducts are still standing. Roman concrete, in the right applications, was an extraordinary material. The insulae were not always built in the right applications. The insula were built by private developers, speculators who were trying to maximize the rental income from a piece of urban land, which meant building as tall as possible, as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible, and maintaining the resulting structure as minimally as possible. The bottom floors, which had thicker walls, better construction, and access to the street, were more expensive and housed more prosperous tenants. The upper floors, thinner walls, worse construction, no running water, no kitchen facilities, further from escape routes, were cheaper and housed the poor. The wealthy Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius complained about the fire risk of insulae construction in the 1st century BC. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, produced one of the most darkly funny accounts of Roman urban life ever written, in which he describes the existential peril of living in an insula with a mordant wit that makes it clear he was writing from experience. His Satire 3 contains a description of the dangers of Rome that reads, across 2 millennia, as the work of someone who had genuinely considered how likely he was to die in his apartment and found the odds uncomfortably high. The fire risk was the primary structural hazard. Rome burned, not metaphorically, literally, repeatedly, catastrophically. The Great Fire of 64 AD, under Nero, destroyed or damaged 10 of Rome's 14 districts and left a large proportion of the city's population homeless. But that was the famous fire. The less famous fires, the regular, ongoing, constant fires that were a feature of Roman urban life throughout the period, were so common that professional fire-watching services existed, and that the Emperor Augustus established the vigils, a force of freedmen whose job was specifically to prevent and fight fires, because the alternative was watching the city burn down on a rotation of roughly every few years. Fire in an insula was particularly terrifying because of the construction materials and the height. Upper floors were often built of wood and lighter materials to reduce the load on the lower concrete and brick walls. Wood burns enthusiastically. Upper floor residents, who were not awake when a fire started on a lower floor, had few good options. The stairs down led toward the fire, the windows up led to a 6-story drop, and the fire moved faster than most people could organize their thoughts. Juvenal's advice, implicit in his description, was essentially, live on the ground floor if you possibly can, and sleep lightly. This was not reassuring advice, but it was accurate advice. The collapsing building was the other structural hazard. Insulae that were built cheaply, maintained minimally, and pushed to their structural limits through height and load could and did collapse. Cicero, in the 1st century BC, mentions owning tenement buildings whose walls had partially collapsed, with the equanimity of a man who has processed this information as a financial rather than a humanitarian matter. Building collapse was common enough to be discussed in legal texts about landlord liability and in satirical literature about the perils of Rome. If you survive your building, and statistically you probably will, because collapse events, while real, were not daily occurrences, you now need to navigate the street. The street is an obstacle course. Let's describe it properly. It is narrow. Roman streets, outside the main arterial roads, were genuinely narrow, sometimes only a few feet wide, barely enough for 2 people to pass each other, certainly not wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass simultaneously. The buildings on either side rise tall enough to block most of the sunlight, creating a shadowed canyon that smells of the full range of urban life at close quarters. The street surface is paved. Rome was a paved city, and the roads that connected it to the rest of the empire were engineering achievements that are still used as foundations for modern roads in some places, but paved with large, irregular stones that create a surface that is technically solid but practically uneven, with gaps between stones that catch feet and wheels, and a surface that becomes genuinely treacherous when wet. The central drainage channel, present in many Roman streets, was where liquid waste was directed, which included rainwater, runoff from fountains, overflow from the small food shops that lined the streets, and the contents of chamber pots that residents of upper floors had emptied from their windows. Roman law technically prohibited the emptying of chamber pots into the street, but Roman law's ability to control what people did at 2 a.m. from a 5th-floor window was, practically speaking, limited. This is your first hazard in the street, things falling on you from above. The Roman satirists are very clear about this. Juvenal specifically warns that walking at night in Rome requires looking up constantly, because the risk of being hit by something falling from an upper window, whether a chamber pot, a broken tile, a piece of crockery, or anything else that a resident had decided to dispose of through the most convenient available aperture, was real and non-trivial. The legal concept of the actio de effusis vel dejectis, the legal action available against someone who had thrown or poured something from a building that caused injury, existed specifically because this happened often enough to require legal remedy. Assume you've navigated the falling objects. You're now dealing with the crowd, because Rome was extraordinarily densely populated for its physical footprint, and the streets were correspondingly crowded in the daytime. Modern estimates of Rome's population at its height range from 800,000 to over 1 million people, concentrated in an urban area of roughly 13 square kilometers within the Aurelian walls. This gives a population density that exceeded that of modern Manhattan, in a city without the vertical transportation, the building codes, the planned street grid, or the sanitation infrastructure that makes modern Manhattan livable. The crowd was not a metaphor. It was a physical reality that Romans complained about constantly. Moving through Rome's streets required physical contact with strangers, extended waits behind slow-moving groups and vehicles, and the constant negotiation of pedestrian right-of-way in spaces where there was not technically enough space for everyone who needed to be there simultaneously. The philosopher Seneca complained about the noise of Rome from his window, the sounds of the baths next door, the street vendors, the metal workers, the people yelling. in a letter that reads as though it was written yesterday by someone living above a particularly active commercial district. The vehicle traffic in the day, supposedly limited by Caesarean and later legislation that banned wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours, with exceptions for construction vehicles, vehicles used in religious ceremonies, and the carts removing building rubble, was actually considerably more complex than the ban implied. The exceptions were broad, enforcement was inconsistent, and the spectacle of a construction cart attempting to navigate a narrow Roman street while pedestrians pressed themselves against buildings to avoid being crushed was a regular feature of Roman daily life. At night, when the full vehicle traffic was legally permitted, the streets became even more dangerous in different ways. The darkness was genuine and deep. Rome had no street lighting in the modern sense. Wealthy Romans traveling at night did so in litters, the enclosed sedan chairs carried by slaves, accompanied by torchbearers who lit the way and implicitly warned other street users that someone important and legally protected was approaching. The poor, traveling at night on foot in the dark, navigated by memory and by whatever ambient light came from the occasional torch at a building entrance. Nighttime Rome was also Rome, at its most criminally active. The city had no police force in any meaningful sense. The vigiles were firefighters who also performed some minor law enforcement functions, and the Praetorian Guard and urban cohorts existed primarily to protect the emperor and maintain public order at a macro level, not to investigate street crime. Individual Romans of the lower classes who were robbed, assaulted, or otherwise victimized in the streets at night had limited official recourse and were largely expected to avoid putting themselves in situations where victimization was likely. Juvenal's description of walking at night in Rome is one of the most vivid passages in Latin literature. You make your will before going out, he says, because the man who hasn't arranged his affairs and walks through Rome at night is merely optimistic. The danger came from various directions. The professional criminal, certainly, but also from drunk men looking for a fight. Specific types of nighttime brawlers appear in the legal and satirical literature with enough frequency to suggest they were a recognized social category, from the general hazards of the dark street and from the particular category of person who was simply angry and needed somewhere to direct it. The streets eventually opened onto the wider spaces of Rome's public infrastructure, the forums, the basilicas, the temples, the baths, the markets, and here the city showed its most impressive face. The Roman Forum, surrounded by the accumulated monuments of centuries of republic and empire, was a genuine architectural achievement that communicated power and civilization effectively. The markets, the great Trajan's market, with its multiple stories of commercial units, was essentially an ancient shopping mall, were functional and well organized. The aqueducts delivered something like 300 gallons of water per person per day to Rome's population, which is more than many modern cities manage. The aqueducts fed the public fountains, the nymphea, and lacus that were distributed throughout the city's neighborhoods, providing fresh, clean, continuously flowing water to anyone who wanted it, for free. This was a genuine public health achievement and a genuine quality of life improvement. Romans without access to private water supplies, which meant most Romans got their water from these public fountains, carrying it home in amphorae or whatever container was available. The water was clean when it arrived from the aqueduct. What happened to it after it arrived in a Roman household was more variable. The public toilets, the forcae, were another impressive piece of Roman public infrastructure. Multi-seat communal latrines, sometimes with a dozen or more seats arranged side by side with no dividers, fed by running water that carried waste away into the sewer system. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, which still runs under Rome today, were distributed through the city. Using them cost a small fee, which provided some revenue for maintenance. Here is the thing about the Roman sewer system. It was impressive. The Cloaca Maxima was built in the 6th century BC, substantially expanded over the following centuries, and was a genuine engineering achievement that managed the liquid waste of a major city for centuries. But it was not designed to handle human waste from residential buildings. It was primarily designed for surface water drainage, and the integration of household waste into the system was imperfect and incomplete. Upper floor residents of Insulae, who had no access to the ground floor latrines and no running water, used chamber pots, which were emptied into the street or into the building's courtyard or into the nearest available receptacle. The ground floor of some insulae had private latrines connected to the sewer system. The upper floors did not. The result was that Rome's impressive sewer infrastructure coexisted with a significant gap between the waste it could handle and the waste being produced, and that gap was filled by the street. You are standing in the street. You have survived the falling objects, navigated the crowd, avoided the cart traffic. You have looked at the aqueduct-fed fountain and thought positive thoughts about Roman engineering. You have noted the public toilet with its carved stone seats and running water and made a mental note. Your stomach is making a different kind of note. You have been in Rome for approximately 45 minutes, and you have not yet eaten anything. And the street around you is full of food vendors whose products smell, some of them anyway, at this particular moment of the day, genuinely appealing. This is your next problem. Chapter 2. What you'd eat, drink, and deeply regret. The food situation in ancient Rome is one of those cases where the surface looks better than the reality, and the reality looks better than the consequences. On the surface, Rome had an extraordinary food culture. The city was the economic center of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, and this meant that an almost inconceivable range of foods flowed into it from every direction. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was to Roman cuisine what soy sauce is to East Asian cuisine, came from production centers across the Mediterranean. Olive oil, the essential fat of Roman cooking, came from Spain, Greece, and North Africa. Grain, the absolutely essential foundation of the Roman food supply, came in massive quantities from the agricultural regions of North Africa and Egypt, shipped across the Mediterranean in a logistics operation of imperial scale. Spices came from Arabia and India through the trade networks that connected Rome to the Eastern world. Exotic foods, dormice, flamingo tongues, sea urchins, dates, exotic fish were available in the markets for those who could afford them and who had the specific culinary worldview that valued serving your guests with something they had never seen before. The Roman cookbook that has survived, the Apicius, a collection of recipes probably compiled in the late 4th or early 5th century AD, but drawing on earlier traditions, is a genuinely fascinating document that reveals a cuisine of considerable sophistication and complexity. The recipes involve elaborate combinations of flavors, careful spicing, and cooking techniques that suggest a serious culinary culture. Rome produced food writers, food critics, in the form of the satirists who mocked the excesses of the wealthy table, and food connoisseurs who were willing to pay extraordinary prices for extraordinary ingredients. All of this is true and interesting. Now let's talk about what you would actually eat. You are not a wealthy Roman. You have appeared in Rome without resources, without connections, without the social network that would gain you access to a patron's table or a wealthy friend's dinner invitation. You are, from the Roman perspective, roughly equivalent to one of the city's enormous population of poor free citizens, the plebs, the masses, who lived in the upper floors of Insulae, collected their free grain dole from the state, and ate primarily from the street food vendors and the thermopolia that lined the city's streets. The thermopolium, from the Greek for hot things for sale, was the Roman equivalent of the fast food restaurant, a counter of masonry, set flush with the street, with round holes in the top into which large ceramic vessels, dolia, were fitted. The dolia kept food warm through the insulating effect of the masonry, and possibly through the use of hot coals below. The menu was what was available, typically a hot stew or porridge of legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat, plus bread, plus wine. Archaeological excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, have revealed dozens of thermopolia in extraordinary detail, complete in some cases with the remnants of the food that was sitting in the dolia when the volcano buried the city. You will eat from a thermopolium. You will pay your A's or 2 asses, small bronze coins that represented the price point of street food. And you will receive a bowl of something hot and a chunk of bread, and possibly some wine. Let's talk about what something hot might mean. The food analysis of the Pompeian Thermopylae remnants has revealed a range of ingredients that were genuinely varied and nutritionally reasonable. Pork, duck, goat, fish, legumes, eggs, nuts, various vegetables. This is actually a somewhat reassuring finding. The Roman poor were not eating purely from grain, and the street food available to them contained real protein and nutritional diversity. The food safety of this food is a different question. Rome did not have refrigeration. The food sitting in the thermopolium's dolia was kept warm, warm enough to be pleasant to eat, warm enough to discourage some bacterial growth through temperature, but not hot enough to sterilize its contents. The food that was sitting in those dolia at the beginning of the day may have been fresh at dawn. By mid-afternoon, it had been sitting in warm clay pots in a busy street for 8 hours. By evening, it had been sitting there for 12 hours. Whether it had been properly prepared, whether the ingredients were fresh when they went in, whether the vessels had been properly cleaned between the previous day's use and the current one. None of this was subject to any regulatory inspection, any standardized hygiene requirement, or any enforcement mechanism. The Roman sources contain complaints about bad food and bad food vendors. Martial, the epigrammatist, makes sardonic observations about Roman street food. Juvenal notes that the poor eat food that dogs would refuse. These are literary exaggerations. Satirists exaggerate, but they are exaggerating something real. Food poisoning in Rome was a genuine hazard, and the specific combination of warm temperatures, communal cooking, no refrigeration, no consistent hygiene practices, and an enormous population producing high demand for cheap food made the Roman street food environment a relatively high-risk one by the standards of what your immune system was trained to handle. Your immune system, specifically. This is the key point. A Roman who had grown up eating Roman street food had a gut microbiome that had been shaped by lifelong exposure to the specific bacterial landscape of Roman food production. Their immune system had developed responses to the specific pathogens it regularly encountered. They had, in the parlance, built up resistance. You have not built up this resistance. You are a 21st century human whose gut microbiome has been shaped by a lifetime of food safety regulations, refrigeration, pasteurization, and standardized hygiene practices. You're immunologically unprepared for the Roman street food environment. This does not mean that eating Roman street food will kill you. It means that you are significantly more likely to experience significant gastrointestinal distress than a native Roman eating the same food, because your gut flora is not equipped for the specific microbial environment. The Romans who lived and ate in Rome all their lives had essentially been naturally immunized through continuous low-level exposure. You have not been. The bread. Let's talk about the Roman bread, because it was the foundation of the diet, and because it had its own specific hazards. Roman bread was made from grain, primarily wheat, specifically a type of wheat different from modern varieties. The grain was ground into flour by mills, water mills, donkey mills, hand mills, and the resulting flour was processed, leavened, and baked in communal bakeries that served the neighborhood. The bread of the Roman poor was darker than the elite wheat bread of wealthy tables, made from less refined flour, containing more of the bran and germ, which was nutritionally better even if the Romans didn't know it. And it was baked in round loaves that were scored into segments before baking, making it easy to tear into individual portions. The grain from which this flour was made had traveled in many cases from Egypt or North Africa across the Mediterranean in ships, unloaded in Rome's harbor at Ostia, transferred to river barges up the Tiber, and stored in Rome's grain warehouses, the Horea, until needed. At each stage of this journey, the grain was potentially exposed to moisture, rodents, insects, and the various fungal organisms that colonize stored grain. The state grain dole, the annona, the free or subsidized grain provided to qualifying citizens, was managed with some attention to quality, but some attention to quality and modern food safety standards are not the same thing. Ergotism, caused by the ergot fungus that infects grain, particularly rye, is a historically documented problem in ancient populations, and while Rome's primary grain was wheat rather than rye, contamination of grain supplies was not limited to ergot. Aflatoxins, produced by aspergillus molds that grow on grain stored in warm, humid conditions, are potent carcinogens and acute toxins. Grain that had been improperly stored or that had been transported under conditions that allowed mold development could contain mycotoxins that produced acute illness or contributed to chronic health problems. The water deserves its own section, because the Roman relationship with water was simultaneously one of the most impressive achievements of ancient civilization and one of its more significant public health challenges. The aqueducts delivered clean water. This is genuinely true. The water that came from the aqueducts was spring water or river water drawn from sources well upstream of the city, transported in covered channels that prevented contamination during transit, and delivered at the fountains in a condition that was genuinely better than the water available in most cities of similar size in other parts of the ancient world. The problem was what happened next. Water taken from the public fountain and carried home in an amphora was exposed to the environment of the home. Amphorae used to store water were also sometimes used to store other things. Wine, oil, fish sauce, and improperly cleaned vessels could contaminate their new contents. Water that sat in a household vessel for any period in the warm Roman climate was subject to the bacterial growth that warm standing water encourages. The wealthy Romans, who had private water connections, pipes running from the aqueduct system directly to their homes, faced a specific additional hazard that the poor with their fountain water did not. Lead. Roman plumbing was made of lead. The word plumbing comes from plumbum, the Latin for lid. And the fittings, pipes, and sometimes the tanks used to hold private water supplies were lead. Lead leaches into water that passes through or stands in lead containers. Lead is a neurotoxin that accumulates in the body, affecting cognitive function, behavior, reproductive health, and multiple organ systems. The lead poisoning hypothesis for Rome's decline. That chronic lead exposure from plumbing and from lead-lined cooking vessels and from wine processed with lead acetate as a sweetener contributed to the cognitive decline of Rome's ruling class has been debated extensively by historians and scientists. The debate about its role in Rome's fall continues. What is not debated is that Romans were exposed to significant lead contamination, that this exposure would have had measurable health effects, and that the wealthy Romans who had private water connections and who used lead-lined vessels for cooking and wine processing were more exposed than the poor who used public fountains and cheaper ceramic cookware. If you drink from a public fountain, you're getting the cleanest water available in Rome, and it's genuinely decent water. If you're invited to the home of a wealthy Roman and offered water from the private supply, you're getting a side serving of heavy metal poisoning with your hospitality. The wine deserves specific attention because it was the beverage of choice for virtually every Roman who could afford it. Water was drunk, but wine was what Romans preferred, and the Roman relationship with wine was complicated, culturally important, and medically significant. Roman wine was not modern wine. It was typically thicker, sweeter, and more concentrated than modern wine, and it was almost universally drunk, diluted with water. Mixing wine with water was considered civilized practice, and drinking undiluted wine was associated with barbarians and with problematic excess. The dilution ratio was typically 2 to 5 parts water to 1 part wine, producing a beverage with an alcohol content well below modern wine. The wine was often stored and processed in lead-lined vessels and amphoras, sealed with lead fixtures. It was sometimes sweetened with a preparation called sapa or defrutum, grape juice boiled down in lead vessels, which produced lead acetate as a byproduct, and which was sweet enough that the Romans used it as a sweetener in cooking and winemaking. The lead content of Roman wine, particularly wine processed with sapa, has been estimated to have been genuinely significant. Some researchers suggest that a regular wine drinker in Rome could have been consuming clinically meaningful amounts of lead through their wine consumption alone. The garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the essential seasoning of Roman cooking, was made from fish that had been packed in salt and left to ferment in the heat for months, producing a brown liquid of extraordinary pungency and extraordinary flavor that Romans put on essentially everything. The fermentation process, done correctly, produced a product that was safe and nutritionally interesting. Garum is high in umami compounds, amino acids, and B vitamins. Done incorrectly, or with fish that had gone bad before the fermentation began, it produced something considerably less safe. Botulinum toxin, the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, thrives in the warm, anaerobic, low-acid environment that improperly managed fish fermentation creates, and it produces what is, gram for gram, one of the most toxic substances on Earth. Most of the garum you'd encounter in Rome was probably fine. The Romans had been making it for centuries and had accumulated practical knowledge about how to do it correctly. But probably fine is not the same as certainly safe, and your exposure to potentially problematic fermented fish products in a city without food safety testing infrastructure was not nothing. Let's say you've eaten your bowl of thermopolium stew, your bread, you've drunk your wine at the standard Roman dilution. You are not yet dead. You might not feel entirely well. The specific combination of flavors that Roman street food presented was substantially different from anything your taste experience has prepared you for. But you are ambulatory and functional. You are about to navigate the social landscape of Rome. And this, in its own way, is as dangerous as the street. Chapter 3. The social minefield. Class, status, and every way to get it wrong. Rome was one of the most status-conscious societies in human history, and status-conscious is doing a lot of diplomatic heavy lifting in that sentence. Let's be direct. Roman society was organized around a hierarchy so elaborate, so codified, so woven into every interaction and every institution that navigating it without the right knowledge was roughly comparable to navigating a minefield without a map. Not navigating it correctly wouldn't necessarily kill you immediately, though in some circumstances it could. But it would make your day, and potentially your life, very much worse, in ways that range from insulting to legally consequential to physically dangerous. Let's start at the top and work down, because you need to understand the entire structure before you can understand where you fit in it and why that matters. At the apex, the emperor. By the period we're discussing, the imperial period of the 1st and 2nd centuries, AD, the emperor was the single most powerful individual in the known Western world, in command of the legions, the treasury, the legal system, and the patronage networks that connected every level of Roman society. The emperor was not quite divine. Roman emperors were deified after death, rather than considered gods during their lifetime, with some exceptions, but the distance between the emperor and everyone else was sufficient that the practical distinction was mostly academic. Below the emperor, the senatorial class, the small number of wealthy landowning families who held senatorial rank, and from whom the senior magistrates, provincial governors, and military commanders were drawn. Senatorial status required a property qualification of 1 million sesterces, and was technically awarded by the Senate, but practically hereditary in many cases. Senators wore the distinctive toga with a broad purple stripe, the toga with the latus clavis, and were addressed with specific titles and accorded specific social privileges that were legally codified and practically enforced. Below senators, the equestrian class, the equites, the knights, who had a property qualification of 400,000 sesterces and wore the toga with a narrow purple stripe. Equestrians staffed the middle levels of the Roman bureaucracy, commanded auxiliary military units, ran the financial administration of the empire, and constituted the managerial class of Roman civilization. Below equestrians, the decurion class, the local elites of Roman municipalities, the city councilors, and local magistrates who ran the administrative machinery of Rome's cities throughout the empire. Their property qualifications and social standing were local rather than imperial, but within their communities they occupied the apex of the social pyramid. Below decurions, the general category of freeborn Roman citizens, the ingenuo, who ranged from prosperous merchants and skilled craftsmen to the urban, poor subsisting on the grain dole. Within this broad category, further distinctions of wealth, occupation, family reputation, and social connection determined one's practical social standing, even if the legal category was nominally the same. Below freeborn citizens, freedmen, slaves who had been manumitted either by purchase of their own freedom or as a gift from their owner. Freedmen were citizens. They could vote, though this was increasingly meaningless. They could own property and run businesses, but they bore the social stigma of former slave status, which affected their access to certain roles and positions, and which they could not fully escape in their own generation. Their children, however, were freeborn citizens without the stigma. Below freedmen, slaves. Rome was a slave society in the most comprehensive sense. Estimates of the slave population of Italy at the height of the Roman Empire range from 30 to 40% of the total population. Roughly 1 in 3 people in Italy was enslaved. Slaves had no legal personhood. They were property legally equivalent to livestock, and their treatment ranged across the full spectrum from the horrific to the relatively humane, depending entirely on the character and circumstances of their owner. A skilled educated slave, a secretary, a physician, a teacher, might live in conditions of relative comfort and have genuine relationships with their owner's household. An agricultural slave on a rural estate or a slave in a mine was living in conditions that were, by any reasonable standard, genuinely terrible. This hierarchy was not theoretical. It was enforced in daily life through dozens of specific mechanisms. Who sat where, who greeted whom first, who wore what clothing, who could speak first in a conversation, who could bring legal action against whom, who could be punished physically and who could not, what punishments were legally applicable to which categories of person. The famous Roman legal distinction between honestiores, the more honorable, senators, equestrians, decurions, and soldiers, and humiliores, the more humble, everyone else, determined what punishments could be applied to you for a given crime. The honestiores faced fines, exile, or execution by relatively dignified methods. The humiliores faced flogging, execution by more brutal methods, or condemnation to the mines, essentially a slow death sentence for equivalent crimes. Your social status was literally the difference between being fined and being beaten. You have appeared in Rome without any of this social scaffolding. You have no patron, no established social identity, no known family, no professional guild membership, no demonstrated citizenship, no obvious social markers that would place you in the hierarchy. This is a problem because Roman social life was organized around the assumption that everyone had a defined place in the hierarchy and behaved accordingly. Today, toga, the Roman citizen's distinctive garment, was one of the most immediately readable social signals in the city. The toga was a large, semicircular piece of wool fabric, roughly 5.5 meters long, worn draped over the body in a specific and rather complicated way that required practice and often the assistance of a slave to arrange correctly. The toga was uncomfortable, difficult to wear, hot in summer, inconvenient for physical activity, and absolutely essential for any formal occasion or public appearance of consequence. Only Roman citizens wore togas. The stripes on the toga told you the wearer's rank. The color of the toga told you the wearer's circumstance. The toga pula, dark in color, was worn in mourning. The toga candida, chalk whitened, was worn by candidates for office. The word candidate comes directly from Candida white. You will not be wearing a toga because you don't know how to put one on, and because producing one would require either stealing it or having a social connection that entitles you to one. What you're wearing, whatever it is, will immediately mark you as either a foreigner or a person of very low social standing, both of which carry implications for how you will be treated in Rome's social landscape. The morning salutatio, the morning greeting ceremony, was one of the most important social institutions of Roman daily life, and it illustrates the social hierarchy's daily operation with particular clarity. The salutatio was the practice by which a patron's clients came to his home in the early morning to greet him, pay their respects, and potentially receive his assistance, whether in the form of a food basket, the sportula, a recommendation to another powerful person, legal assistance, or simply the social credit that came from being publicly associated with an important man. The patron-client relationship was one of the fundamental organizing structures of Roman society. Almost everyone in Rome was simultaneously a client to someone more powerful and a patron to someone less powerful. The web of these obligations and dependencies connected the city from top to bottom. A senator was the patron of equestrians and wealthy freedmen, who were themselves the patrons of less prosperous clients, who were in turn the patrons of poor freedmen, and citizens who were the patrons of, well, there was always someone further down the chain to whom you could be important. If you want to survive in Rome, if you want access to resources, protection, assistance, legal support, social introduction, you need a patron. And the process of acquiring a patron, if you arrive in Rome without existing social connections, was not a simple or safe one. You could not simply walk up to a wealthy Roman and declare yourself available for clienthood. The patron-client relationship required a social introduction. Someone who already knew the patron had to vouch for you, to present you as worth the patron's investment of time and resources. Without an existing social network to provide this introduction, you were functionally locked out of the patronage system. And without the patronage system, you were without the most important support structure that Roman society provided. This left you with the other available communities. The trade guilds, the collegia. The collegia were associations of people with shared occupations, shared neighborhoods, or shared religious practices. Essentially the Roman equivalent of professional associations and civic organizations combined. They provided their members with social support, mutual aid in crisis, the collective resources to give members a proper burial, a significant concern in a society where burial practices had religious significance, and a social community within the city's anonymous mass. Joining a collegium required being in the relevant trade or neighborhood and being accepted by the existing members, not an impossible barrier, but not a trivial one either. The practical social dangers of getting the status hierarchy wrong were immediate and real. Romans of higher status expected and received deference from those of lower status, in forms that were specific and physically enacted. You were supposed to make way for the senator in the street. You were supposed to rise when a magistrate entered. You were supposed to greet a social superior before they greeted you, not the reverse. Initiating a greeting to someone of significantly higher status could itself be interpreted as a presumption. The specific titles of address, the honorifics, the forms of greeting, varied by status in ways that required knowledge to navigate. Getting these things wrong in small ways produced social friction and social disapproval. You were marked as ignorant, as a provincial, as someone not worth serious consideration. Getting them wrong in larger ways, failing to show proper deference to someone with the power and inclination to enforce it, could produce consequences ranging from public humiliation to physical violence. The legal system's differential treatment of social categories was another dimension of danger. If you were attacked in the street and brought your complaint to a magistrate, the outcome depended heavily on the relative social standing of yourself and your attacker. An assault by a slave or a freedman on a freeborn citizen was treated very differently from an assault by a citizen on another citizen, which was treated very differently from an assault by a person of high status on a person of low status. The The direction of social inequality shaped the legal response. The practice of infamia, the legal status of social disgrace that was applied to specific categories of people for specific reasons, provides another illustration of the hierarchy's legal teeth. Infamia was applied to prostitutes, to actors and gladiators, to people who had been convicted of certain crimes, to those who had behaved in ways that Roman law considered degrading. Infamia removed legal rights, the ability to represent others in court, the ability to serve in the legions, the ability to hold public office. It was a legal mechanism for enforcing the social hierarchy's exclusions. The religious dimension of Roman social life added another layer of requirements. Roman religion was not a faith in the modern sense. It was a set of practices, rituals, and obligations that were inseparable from civic and social life. Participation in the religious rituals of the city, the sacrifices, the festivals, the proper observance of the religious calendar was part of being a Roman citizen and a member of Roman society. Failure to participate, or participation in ways that were considered improper or impious, was socially and potentially legally problematic. The emperor cult, the practice of honoring the emperor and the imperial family through religious ceremony, was by the 1st and 2nd centuries AD a significant element of the religious landscape, and failure to participate in it was interpreted as political disloyalty as much as religious impiety. This is the context in which the early Christians' refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, his divine spirit, was perceived as a genuine political threat rather than simply a religious peculiarity. Let's put you in a specific social scenario to make this concrete. You are walking through the forum. A man in a toga with a broad purple stripe approaches, surrounded by attendants. He is a senator. You can read the stripe. You've done your research. You need to step aside. You step aside. So far, so good. But the senator's freedman's secretary, a man in ordinary clothing, no obvious status markers, approaches you with a question. Who are you? And what is your business in the forum today? This is not an idle question. The forum was Rome's civic center, and the comings and goings of people in it were noted. You are clearly not a Roman citizen. You don't have a toga. You don't carry yourself with the easy confidence of someone who knows exactly where they stand in the social order. Your Latin, if you have any, is wrong in ways that are immediately obvious to a native speaker. Your answer to this question matters. If you claim a status you can't support, claim citizenship without the ability to demonstrate it, claim a social connection to someone powerful without that person's knowledge, and this claim is investigated and found wanting, the consequences ranged from public embarrassment to legal proceedings for fraud to physical punishment, depending on the specific claim and the specific person who felt deceived. If you admit to being a foreigner, a peregrinus, a non-citizen, you have a legal category, but one with fewer protections and more restrictions than citizenship. Foreigners in Rome were generally tolerated. Rome was a cosmopolitan city with substantial populations from across the empire and beyond, but they operated with fewer legal protections and were more vulnerable to exploitation and mistreatment. The social minefield of Rome required a map that took years of socialization to acquire. You don't have that map. Every interaction involves the risk of a misstep that can range from mildly embarrassing to genuinely consequential. You are, from the moment you arrive, operating in a social environment whose rules you don't fully know. In a social hierarchy you can't fully read, with a legal status that gives you fewer protections than you're accustomed to. And you haven't even gotten to the entertainment options yet. Chapter 4. Roman medicine. The cure that might kill you. Faster, you are sick. This should not come as a surprise. You have been in Rome for approximately half a day. You have walked through streets that function as an open sewer. You have eaten food from a vessel that has been warm all morning. You have drunk wine from a cup that may have had lead in it. You have breathed air that contains the collective respiratory output of 1 million people, a significant proportion of whom are also sick. You have touched surfaces, door handles, market stalls, the arms of strangers pushing past you in the crowd, that have been touched by thousands of hands before yours. You are now experiencing symptoms. We will not specify which symptoms, because the range of possibilities is broad, and most of them are unpleasant to describe in detail. Let's simply say that something is wrong, it is getting worse, and you have decided that you need medical attention. This decision is understandable. It is also going to present you with a set of choices that range from unhelpful to actively dangerous, because Roman medicine was a field of genuine intellectual sophistication built on a theoretical foundation that was, in its fundamental assumptions about how the human body works, incorrect, and the treatments that flowed from those incorrect assumptions were, in a significant number of cases, worse than doing nothing. Let's understand the theoretical framework first, because it produced everything that followed. Roman medicine, by the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the height of the classical medical tradition, was built on the humoral theory inherited from Greek medicine, particularly from Hippocrates and his school, and subsequently developed and systematized by Galen of Pergamon, who was the most influential physician in the Roman world, and whose authority in medicine remained dominant in the Western tradition until the 17th century. That last fact, that Galen's influence persisted for 15 centuries after his death, tells you something about both his intellectual achievement and the intellectual conservatism of his successors. Galen was a genuinely remarkable person. He was a prolific writer. His surviving works constitute a larger body of text than any other ancient author. A careful observer, an innovative experimenter by ancient standards, and a skilled surgeon whose anatomical knowledge exceeded that of most of his contemporaries. He was also extremely confident in his own correctness, which was both a reflection of his genuine expertise and a significant intellectual liability, because the areas where Galen was wrong tended to be areas where his confidence discouraged subsequent investigation. The core of Galenic medicine was the humoral theory. The body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, whose balance constituted health, and whose imbalance constituted disease. Each humor had specific qualities, seasonal associations, and correspondences with organs and temperaments. Treatment was aimed at restoring the balance of the humors, which meant either reducing excess humors through bloodletting, purging, sweating, inducing vomiting, or restricting the foods thought to produce the offending humor, or supplementing deficient ones through specific foods, drinks, or medications thought to increase the needed humor. This framework was internally consistent and intellectually sophisticated. It produced specific diagnoses: you have too much blood, evidenced by these symptoms, and specific treatments, therefore we will remove some blood. The logic was coherent within its own framework. The problem was that the framework was built on incorrect premises about what the humors actually were, what they did, and how they related to disease. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile are real things that exist in the human body in some form, but they are not the fundamental regulators of health and disease that humoral theory held them to be. Fever is not caused by excess heat in the blood. It is caused by the immune system's response to infection, and it is often a beneficial response rather than a symptom requiring reduction. The phlegm of a chest cold is not a manifestation of excess phlegm humor. It is the product of inflammation and immune activity in the respiratory tract. Reducing it through aggressive treatment may make the patient feel slightly more comfortable while doing nothing to address the underlying viral infection. Here is where you enter the picture. You are sick. You need a physician. Let's go find one. The medical profession in Rome was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively well developed. Physicians, medici, practiced throughout the city, ranging from highly trained practitioners who had studied at the great medical schools of Alexandria or Pergamon, to barely trained practitioners who had picked up some basic knowledge through apprenticeship or self-study and hung out a shingle. There was no formal licensing system. Anyone could call themselves a physician and begin practicing, which meant that the quality of available practitioners was extremely variable. The emperor and the wealthy had access to the best physicians available. Greek-trained, experienced, knowledgeable within the limits of the period's medical understanding. The poor had access to whoever was available in their neighborhood, which might be a skilled practitioner or might be a former slave with some medical training, or a herb seller with a confident manner and a dramatic delivery. Your options for finding a physician, as a person without resources or social connections, lean toward the lower end of this quality spectrum. But let's be generous and assume you find someone reasonably competent, someone who knows Galenic medicine well, who takes your case seriously, who examines you with attention and care. What happens next? The examination begins with questioning. The physician asks about your symptoms, their onset, their character, their progression. He examines your urine. Uroscopy, the examination of urine for color, clarity, consistency, and odor, was a major diagnostic tool in ancient medicine, and physicians could identify some conditions from urine examination while drawing wildly incorrect conclusions about others. He takes your pulse. Galen developed sophisticated pulse theory, identifying dozens of pulse qualities that corresponded to different conditions, and the skilled Galenic physician could extract real information from pulse examination, even if his theoretical framework for interpreting it was wrong in some respects. He reaches a diagnosis. Let's say he concludes, based on your symptoms, that you are suffering from an excess of blood heat, that your blood humor has become overly warm and is producing the symptoms you're experiencing. This is a plausible Galenic diagnosis for a febrile illness. The prescribed treatment will likely include some combination of the following: bloodletting, the removal of blood from the patient through opening a vein, phlebotomy, or through the application of leeches. Hirudotherapy was the most commonly prescribed treatment in the Galenic tradition for conditions involving excess of the blood humor, particularly febrile conditions where the blood was considered to be in an overheated or agitated state. The physician would open a vein, typically in the arm, and allow a specific quantity of blood to drain, judged by the change in the patient's symptoms, by the color and consistency of the blood, and by theoretical considerations about how much blood the patient could safely spare. Bloodletting is almost universally harmful in febrile illness. The body's immune response to infection requires adequate blood volume to deliver immune cells and antibodies to sites of infection, to maintain body temperature, to sustain the cardiovascular function needed to support recovery. Removing blood from a patient fighting an infection reduces the resources available for that fight. The patient may feel temporarily better. The removal of blood produces a relaxation response, a drop in blood pressure, and sometimes a brief subjective improvement in symptoms. And this temporary improvement was taken as evidence that the treatment was working. It was not evidence that the treatment was working. It was evidence that blood loss produces a physiological response that can temporarily mask symptoms. The Roman medical tradition's reliance on bloodletting as a primary therapeutic tool was so profound and so persistent that it is one of the most significant examples in medical history of a harmful treatment being maintained through cultural authority and theoretical coherence, rather than empirical evidence of benefit. Galen's authority was sufficient to sustain bloodletting as a major medical intervention for 1,500 years, through generations of physicians who had access to the same clinical observation that could have told them it wasn't working, but who interpreted that observation through a theoretical framework that made the failures invisible. The purging was another standard intervention. Laxatives, ranging from relatively gentle plant-based preparations to the violently active preparations derived from plants like hellebore, colocynth, and scammony, were prescribed to expel excess humors through the bowel. For a patient who was already ill, already potentially dehydrated from fever, the addition of a powerful laxative produced fluid loss that worsened the condition. Hellebore, specifically, was both a potent purge and a toxic plant, and the distinction between a therapeutic dose and a harmful one was difficult to maintain consistently, particularly in a patient whose condition affected their tolerance for physiological stress. The vomiting induction, emetics to bring up the stomach's contents as a way of expelling excess humor, was prescribed for various conditions with similar problems. Strong emetics in a weakened patient, produced the risk of aspiration, of electrolyte imbalance, of mechanical damage to the esophagus, on top of the fluid loss that was already a concern. Here is the specific difficulty with Roman medicine from your perspective. A modern physician treats symptoms and attempts to support the body's own recovery mechanisms, while avoiding interventions that make things worse. A Galenic physician treats the underlying humoral imbalance through active intervention that was designed, with the best intentions, to restore balance. And these interventions frequently made things worse by removing the resources the body needed for its own recovery. The physician who means well, who is doing exactly what his training and his tradition tell him to do, is quite possibly going to make you sicker through the treatment than you would have been if left alone to recover. This is the specific tragedy of Galenic medicine. It was practiced by intelligent, educated, caring individuals who were systematically harmed by the incorrectness of their foundational assumptions. What actually worked in Roman medicine? Some things genuinely worked. Roman surgery was, by ancient standards, impressive. Surgeons used instruments that would be recognizable to modern surgeons, performed procedures including cataract surgery, trepanation, drilling into the skull for specific indications, amputations, and repair of hernias and other structural problems with genuine skill. The Roman military medical service, the Medici attached to the legions, had developed trauma surgery protocols through the practical experience of dealing with battlefield wounds, and their outcomes for specific types of injury were better than their theoretical framework would have predicted, because surgery is, to some degree, a technical skill that can be developed through practice, independent of theoretical understanding. Wound care in the Roman tradition included some genuinely effective elements. The use of honey on wounds, an ancient practice across multiple cultures, has been vindicated by modern research, as we discussed in our medieval medicine section. The use of wine as a wound wash, pouring wine on a wound before dressing it, provided some antiseptic benefit through the alcohol content, though Roman wine's alcohol concentration was lower than ideal for this purpose. Specific herbal preparations used in Roman medicine had genuine pharmacological activity. Opium, derived from the poppy, was available and used for pain management, and it works. Willow bark for pain and fever works, as we've established. Various plant preparations had genuine effects on the conditions they were used to treat. The Roman emphasis on diet and lifestyle as components of health. Galen's extensive dietary prescriptions, the Roman tradition of distinguishing between foods by their effects on the humors, the general prescription of moderation in eating and drinking and exercise. Vrind reflected an intuition that how you lived affected your health, which is correct even if the specific mechanism proposed, humoral balance, was wrong. The baths, which we will discuss in more detail in the next chapter, were prescribed medicinally as well as used recreationally, and the combination of hot water, exercise, and social interaction that the baths provided had genuine positive effects on physical and mental health that were not entirely dependent on the humoral explanation offered for them. But the baseline problem remains. If you are seriously ill, if you have a bacterial infection that in a modern setting would be treated with a course of antibiotics and would resolve within a week, Roman medicine has nothing that can reliably kill the pathogen. The best outcome is that your immune system defeats the infection while the physician's interventions do not significantly impede it. The worst outcome is that the combination of the infection and the treatment overwhelms your body's ability to compensate. The Roman physician looking at a patient with bacterial pneumonia, with a puerperal fever, with a wound infection that has gone septic, with typhoid, with tuberculosis, was looking at a condition that fell outside the range of what his intervention could address, and the aggressive interventions he would apply, the bloodletting, the purging, were more likely to hasten death than to prevent it. The specific arithmetic of Roman mortality reflects this. Infant mortality was extremely high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before the age of 10, with the first years of life being the most dangerous. Life expectancy at birth was roughly 25 to 35 years, heavily influenced by this infant mortality. Those who survived childhood had a reasonable prospect of reaching their 50s or 60s, but the regular toll of infectious disease on adults, the dangers of childbirth, the hazards of the physical environment, and the systematic harm done by well-intentioned medical treatment combined to produce a mortality profile that was dramatically worse than the modern equivalent. If you are reading this as a Roman, this is simply the world. You have no frame of reference for a world where infections routinely respond to specific treatments, where childhood mortality is a rare tragedy rather than a statistical expectation, where surgery is performed under general anesthesia in conditions of sterility, rather than in a field hospital with wine as the primary antiseptic. If you are a modern person dropped into this world, you have a very different frame of reference, and that frame of reference includes the knowledge that the treatment being proposed for your illness may be worse than the illness itself. Your best strategy, if you fall ill in Rome, is to find a physician whose interventions tend toward the conservative, who prescribes rest, dietary modification, and herbal preparations rather than aggressive bloodletting and purging, while hoping that your immune system, which has been trained by a lifetime of vaccines and modern medical interventions against the specific pathogens likely to be active in Rome in 100 AD, is up to the task. It might be, it might not be. This uncertainty is, unfortunately, the defining feature of the medical landscape you have entered. Chapter 5. Entertainment and its hazards, the baths, the games, and the theater. Let's say you've survived the morning. You've navigated the streets, you've eaten, you've managed the social landscape without making a catastrophic error, and you've avoided needing a physician. The afternoon stretches before you. Rome is a city that takes entertainment seriously. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, was coined by the Roman satirist Juvenal, specifically to describe the Roman state's strategy of keeping the urban population content through food distribution and public spectacle. And, while Juvenal meant it as a criticism, it accurately describes a real policy that produced real entertainment on an extraordinary scale. You want to participate in this entertainment. You want to experience Rome as Romans experienced it. Let's go through your options, and let's be honest about what each of them involves. The obvious starting point is the baths. The thermae, Rome's great public bathhouses, were among the most impressive public institutions in the ancient world, and they were genuinely impressive in ways that go beyond the tourist brochure description. The great imperial baths, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, both built slightly later than our period, but representative of the form at its height, were vast complexes that served as community centers as well as bathing facilities. They included hot rooms, caldaria, warm rooms, tepidaria, cold rooms, frigidaria, swimming pools, natatio, exercise areas, palaestrae, libraries, gardens, and shops, all within a single monumental complex. The experience was designed to be total. You could spend an entire afternoon in the baths and emerge having bathed, exercised, socialized, browsed books, and done your shopping. The admission fee was minimal. A quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, was the standard bath admission in many facilities. On some occasions, the entry was free, either because a magistrate or wealthy citizen had paid for everyone's admission as a public benefaction, or because the emperor had decreed free admission. The baths were, in this sense, genuinely democratic, a space where Romans of different social classes mixed in the same water. The mixed in the same water part deserves attention. The water in the Roman baths was not changed frequently. The great pools of the caldarium and the frigidarium held large volumes of water that were heated and maintained continuously, but not replaced with every new group of bathers. The water in which you were bathing was the water in which everyone else had been bathing. For how long exactly before the pool was drained and refilled? The archaeological and documentary record suggests that the pools were maintained and managed with some attention to cleanliness, in a world without germ theory and without modern water treatment is not the same as actually clean. The hot pool was particularly interesting from a microbiological perspective. Warm water, not boiling, not cold, but the comfortable warm temperature of the Roman caldarium, is essentially an ideal incubator for the organisms that thrive in that temperature range. A large warm pool, used continuously by hundreds or thousands of people daily, who entered it in various states of personal cleanliness, was a potential reservoir for a range of waterborne and skin contact pathogens. The Romans who used the baths regularly had some degree of acquired immunity to the regular, microbial inhabitants of the bath pool. You have not. The specific hazard of Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba that lives in warm, fresh water and causes a rare but almost universally fatal infection called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, is worth mentioning here, not because it was a common risk. It's extremely rare even in warm water environments, but because it provides a memorable illustration of the principle. Warm water environments harbor microorganisms that are not visible, not smellable, not detectably present to the bather, and that are capable of serious harm. More commonly, the bath environment carried risks of skin infections, fungal infections, athlete's foot, and its relatives thrive in warm, moist environments, eye infections, and gastrointestinal infections if water was inadvertently swallowed. None of these were certain consequences of bathing. They were statistical risks in an environment that had specific characteristics. The social dimension of the baths also carried hazards of a different kind. Bathing in Rome was conducted without clothing, which meant that the baths were, despite their civic and respectable function, also spaces where social barriers were reduced in ways that created various forms of social friction. Theft was a consistent problem. Leaving your clothes in the changing room, the apodicterium, while you bathed created an obvious opportunity, and the figure of the bath thief appears frequently enough in Roman literature and legal texts to suggest it was a genuine ongoing issue. You could hire a slave to watch your clothes if you had a slave, which you don't. Mixed bathing, men and women using the same facilities, was practiced at some periods and in some establishments, and abolished and re-established at various points. The Emperor Hadrian, in the early 2nd century AD, issued an edict separating male and female bathing hours, suggesting that mixed bathing was occurring and was considered problematic. The sexual and social implications of naked mixed-sex bathing in ancient Rome were exactly what you would expect, and the baths had a well-established reputation in some quarters as a venue for activities beyond bathing. The oil scraping that was a standard part of the Roman bathing routine. Romans did not use soap in the modern sense, but instead applied olive oil to the skin and scraped it off with a curved metal implement called a strigil, taking the surface dirt and dead skin with it. Was performed either by a slave, if you had one, or by a bath attendant, if you could afford to hire one, or by yourself, if you could reach all the relevant areas, which presented some geometric challenges. The strigils in circulation in the baths were probably shared and probably not sterilized between users, which added their own microbiological dimension to the bathing experience. Despite all of this, the baths were genuinely beneficial in net terms for the Roman population. Regular washing, even in water of uncertain microbiological quality, was better than not washing. The exercise provided by the palaestra was genuinely good for health. The social function of the baths, the communal gathering, the conversation, the maintenance of social networks, had real psychological benefits. The baths were, on balance, a positive element of Roman life, just not quite as positive as they looked from the outside. Now let's talk about the gladiatorial games, because they are the most famous element of Roman entertainment culture, and because they illustrate something specific about Roman values and Roman social psychology that is genuinely illuminating, and also because they present a specific set of hazards for the modern observer. The Munera, the gladiatorial games, were not a daily feature of Roman life. They were special occasions, given by wealthy individuals or magistrates as public benefactions, initially associated with funeral rites and subsequently becoming a form of political spectacle and popular entertainment. A major munus in Rome could last multiple days and involve dozens or hundreds of gladiators, wild animal fights, the venations, and public executions, the damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild animal, which was inflicted on criminals condemned to death. The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, completed in 80 AD, seated approximately 50,000 spectators and was the premier venue for these spectacles. The seating arrangement within the Colosseum reflected Rome's social hierarchy with exquisite precision. The emperor and the Vestal virgins had dedicated seats in the best position. The senatorial class sat in the lowest tier, closest to the arena. The equestrian class sat in the next tier. The general citizenry sat further up, segregated by sex and social status, in ways that were regulated by law. The Lex Iulia Theatralis of Augustus regulated seating arrangements in all public spectacle venues, specifying where different categories of person were and were not permitted to sit. If you want to watch the games, you need to find a seat that corresponds to your apparent social status. You don't have a patron with senatorial tickets. You're sitting with the general public in the upper tiers, in the heat, at a distance that makes the action in the arena visible, but not detailed, without the shade that the podium seats had, potentially squashed between strangers for hours. The Colosseum had a velarium, a massive awning that could be extended over part of the seating area to provide shade. It was operated by sailors from the Roman naval base at Misenum, who were stationed in Rome, specifically for this purpose, which tells you something about how complex the operation of this entertainment venue was. Whether the velarium covered your section of the seating depended on the precise configuration of the awning and the direction of the sun, and if you were in an uncovered section in a Roman August, the experience was genuinely punishing in the thermal sense. The crowd itself was a hazard. 50,000 people packed into a tiered stone amphitheater, emotionally engaged with the spectacle below, representing a cross-section of Rome's population from the respectable upper classes in the lower tiers to the rough and unruly elements of the urban mob in the upper reaches. This was not a peaceful environment. Roman crowds at spectacles were loud, partisan, and occasionally violent. Crowd violence at entertainment venues, not just at gladiatorial games, but at the Circus Maximus chariot races, was documented and real. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus were, in terms of sheer audience size, the dominant form of Roman mass entertainment. The Circus Maximus seated approximately 250,000 people, a quarter of Rome's total population, and the atmosphere during the races was intense in ways that the sources describe with a mixture of enthusiasm and alarm. The chariot racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, the whites, had fanatical supporters who identified with their faction in ways that sound remarkably familiar to anyone who has experienced modern sports fandom, including the willingness to riot when things went badly. You, watching the races as an outsider with no faction allegiance and no understanding of the specific rivalries and tensions of the current racing season, are at risk of accidentally expressing enthusiasm for the wrong faction at the wrong moment in the wrong section of the crowd. This is a more dangerous mistake than it sounds. The spectacle of the gladiatorial games themselves, the violence that was the point of the entertainment, is worth addressing directly because it is the element that most clearly marks the difference between Roman and modern cultural sensibility. Gladiatorial combat was real violence, with real injury and real death conducted before. An audience that regarded it as legitimate entertainment, as an expression of virtues, Roman masculine virtue, and as a politically important demonstration of Roman values around courage, endurance, and the proper relationship between the individual and death. Modern audiences who think they are comfortable with screen violence, who have seen countless film depictions of violence without being significantly disturbed, frequently underestimate the psychological impact of actual violence conducted in person, at close range, with genuine stakes. The gladiators themselves, contrary to popular depiction, were not the random, condemned criminals of the movie version. Gladiators were trained athletes who specialized in specific fighting styles, who were valuable investments for the Lannistai, who owned them, and who therefore were not casually killed when they lost. The gesture that determined a defeated gladiator's fate, the thumbs up or thumbs down of popular imagination, though the actual gesture was probably different from this simplified version, involved the audience and the editor, the sponsor of the games, in a decision that was influenced by the gladiator's performance, the crowd's mood, and the gladiator's own willingness to accept death with the correct Roman dignity. Death in the arena was therefore not as common as the popular account suggests, at least not in the regular gladiatorial bouts. It was considerably more common in the animal hunts and the public executions. The noontime lull between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial combats was traditionally filled with the public execution of condemned criminals, sometimes in elaborate spectacles that combined mythological or historical staging with real killing. If you are watching from the upper tiers of the Colosseum, you are watching real deaths at sufficient distance that the immediate visceral impact is reduced, but they are real deaths of real people, conducted as entertainment, and your reaction to this, whether horror, detachment, or the disturbing acculturation that the regular attenders had developed, is going to be one of the more significant psychological challenges of your day in Rome. The theater, the dramatic performances that were another major form of Roman public entertainment, was generally safer in the physical sense, though it had its own social dynamics worth noting. Roman theater had a complex history. The great tradition of Greek drama was adapted into Roman form, but the most popular theatrical entertainments of the imperial period were often mime, a form of physical comedy and drama that was considerably less intellectually elevated than the classical tradition, and pantomime, in which a single performer played multiple roles through dance and gesture while a chorus sang the narrative. Theater seating, like amphitheater seating, was regulated by the lex Iulia Theatralis with the same precision of social hierarchy. The wrong seat at the theater was as much of a social error as the wrong seat at the games, with consequences ranging from public humiliation to legal sanction. The theater was also, by the imperial period, associated in Roman conservative opinion with moral looseness. Actors, histriones, were persons of infamia, socially disgraced by their profession, and the theatrical environment was considered corrupting by those whose values ran toward traditional Roman sternness. This conservative anxiety about the theater reflected the genuine social mixing and boundary crossing that theatrical environments often facilitated, and it was not entirely without foundation. The entertainment landscape of Rome was extraordinary in scale, in variety, and in the sophistication with which it served its social and political functions. It was also in the physical conditions of the mass audience, in the genuine violence of some of its content, in the social rigidity of its seating arrangements, an environment that required navigation as careful as the street outside. Chapter 6. The Law, the Legion, and the Many Ways to Accidentally Commit a Crime. By late afternoon, you have bathed, you have watched something in the arena. You have navigated the social landscape of the streets and the public spaces with varying degrees of success. You are tired. You're probably somewhat overwhelmed. And somewhere in the course of your day, in ways that you may not have realized, you have almost certainly committed a crime. Not intentionally. The problem is not that you are a criminal. The problem is that Rome's legal system was extraordinarily detailed, applied differentially across the social hierarchy, and contained enough specific prohibitions and obligations, many of them enforced with disproportionate severity relative to the offense, that an uninformed newcomer moving through the city had a significant probability of violating something without knowing it. Let's talk about what you've probably done. The Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficis, the law on assassins and poisoners, originally passed in 81 BC and substantially developed since, was broad enough in its provisions that various forms of carrying weapons in public fell under its scope. Did you pick up anything that could be classified as a weapon during the day? A stout stick for walking in the streets, a knife for eating? In certain legal contexts, the possession of such items by a person of uncertain status in a public space could attract attention under this law or its associated regulations. The Lex Cornelia de Injurias, the law on injuries, covered a range of actions that constituted offenses against a person's honor and dignity. These included not just physical assault, but verbal insults, following someone, and various forms of conduct that modern law would not criminalize at all. More specifically, the severity of the offense under this law was directly calibrated to the status of the victim. An insult to a senator was a far more serious legal matter than the same insult to a freedman, and the penalty was correspondingly scaled. The laws governing public behavior in Rome were numerous and specific. Defacing public property, including writing on walls, which Romans did constantly, and which constitutes one of our best sources of Roman popular opinion in the graffiti-covered walls of Pompeii, was technically illegal. Blocking the street with merchandise or assembly was regulated. Proper disposal of waste was regulated, though enforcement was, as we have noted, somewhat theoretical. But let's focus on the most dangerous legal territory you might accidentally enter: anything involving the political or religious sphere. The crime of majestas, the crime of diminished majesty, essentially the crime of disrespecting or undermining the authority of the Roman state and the emperor, was one of the most feared legal categories in the imperial period because its definition was sufficiently broad to encompass a wide range of behavior, and its prosecution was sometimes used as a political weapon against enemies of the emperor or his associates. Writing or saying something that could be construed as critical of the emperor, associating with people who had been condemned for political offenses, possessing documents that contained anything politically sensitive. All of these could potentially fall under the majestas umbrella. The problem with majestas prosecutions was that they depended heavily on interpretation and on the political environment of the moment. Under a stable and relatively moderate emperor, Trajan, in our period, was generally considered one of the better emperors. Majestas prosecutions were less frequent and less arbitrary than under the paranoid late emperors whose reigns produced the worst political terror. But less frequent and none are not the same thing, and the risk was never zero. The informer system, the use of professional accusers, delatores, who brought prosecutions on a fee-for-results basis, was one of the more unpleasant features of the imperial legal landscape. A delator who successfully prosecuted a wealthy defendant was entitled to a proportion of the convicted person's confiscated property, which created powerful financial incentives for bringing prosecutions. The delator system was recognized by Romans themselves as a source of legal injustice. Pliny the Younger and Tacitus both wrote about it with disgust. But it was also extremely difficult to suppress because it was financially self-sustaining. The military represented another legal universe operating within Rome. The presence of soldiers in the city, the legal privileges of military personnel, and the specific ways in which civilian encounters with soldiers could go wrong deserve attention. Rome's permanent military presence in the city included the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, stationed in a camp on the northeastern edge of the city, and the urban cohorts, the force responsible for maintaining public order at a macro level. These were not police in the modern sense. They were military units whose relationship with civilian law was governed by specific regulations that gave soldiers significant advantages in any legal dispute with civilians. A soldier had the right to demand services from civilians in ways that were legally backed, commandeering lodging, demanding carrying services, under a general principle of military requisition that civilian law could not easily resist. The specific legal privileges of soldiers meant that in a dispute between a soldier and a civilian, the civilian was operating at a significant disadvantage, and the physical disadvantage compounded the legal one. The practical advice of Roman writers about encounters with soldiers in the city was essentially avoid conflict, defer, and do not argue about the legal merits of the situation, because the legal merits were less immediately relevant than the physical and political realities. A civilian who prevailed in a legal argument with a soldier was still subject to the immediate physical consequences of having irritated someone with a sword who was operating in an environment where his use of force was hard to call to account. The slaves you encountered throughout the day occupied a specific and disturbing position in Rome's legal landscape that is worth addressing directly. Slaves who were accused of crimes against their masters, or who were witnesses in cases where their testimony was needed, were tortured as a matter of routine. Roman legal doctrine held that the testimony of a slave was only legally reliable if extracted under torture, because slaves were considered to have insufficient independent moral standing to be relied upon for voluntary testimony. This doctrine produced a legal system in which the torture of people, the systematic infliction of severe pain on human beings who had no recourse, was a normalized feature of judicial procedure. If you, in the course of your day, had any kind of transaction or conflict involving a slave, and that situation attracted legal attention, the slave might be tortured as part of the investigation. You would watch this. You would probably find it deeply disturbing. It would not be considered unusual by the Romans around you. The legal system's treatment of free poor people was considerably more lenient than its treatment of slaves, but the humiliores honestiores distinction we mentioned earlier meant that a poor freeborn Roman facing criminal charges was subject to punishments, flogging, the mines, certain forms of execution that were specifically unavailable for the upper classes. The universality of law before the court was a concept that was present in Roman legal thought, but considerably less present in Roman legal practice. The specific processes of Roman legal procedure were elaborate enough that the casual participant had little chance of navigating them effectively. Roman law was complex. The corpus of Roman legal writing is one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, and its influence on Western legal systems continues to the present day. But its complexity was a barrier as well as an achievement. Operating effectively in the Roman legal system required either personal legal expertise or the services of a jurisconsult or advocate, and these services were available on the same patron-client basis as everything else in Rome, which meant that your access to effective legal representation depended on your social connections. Without those connections, you were navigating a complex legal system with significant personal risks, no legal representation, and no reliable knowledge of what you had and hadn't done that was legally significant. This is not a comfortable position. The combination of the social hierarchies, legal implications, the differential treatment of different classes, the broad definition of certain offenses, and the informer system created a legal environment that was genuinely hazardous for the uninformed newcomer in ways that had nothing to do with actual criminal intent. By the end of the day, if you have made it to the end of the day without being arrested, poisoned, crushed by falling masonry, robbed in a dark street, or given a genuinely unfortunate medical treatment for the illness you contracted from the street food, you are doing remarkably well by the statistics of the environment you've entered. The darkness is falling. The cart traffic is resuming. The streets are taking on the specific character of Roman nighttime, which is to say they are becoming both more dangerous and less visible. The question of where you are going to sleep, whether you have found lodging in one of the city's many insulae or hospitia, and whether that lodging is on a floor that is unlikely to collapse or catch fire during the night, is now the most pressing practical question remaining. You have had a day in ancient Rome. You have experienced its streets, its food, its social dynamics, its medical system, its entertainment, and its legal landscape. You have survived it just barely, with the kind of wide-eyed, slightly shell-shocked expression of someone who has read extensively about a place and then discovered that the reality was considerably more intense than the reading suggested. Chapter 7. The smell, the noise, and the things nobody tells you. The sensory experience of Rome. Let's have an honest conversation about something that every book about ancient Rome manages to skip over in its rush to get to the aqueducts and the Pantheon and the philosophical tradition. The smell, not the smell in passing. not a polite acknowledgement that Rome was a pre-modern city with pre-modern sanitation and therefore smelled somewhat different from a modern city. A real, sustained, honest engagement with what Rome actually smelled like, because the olfactory experience of ancient Rome was so fundamentally different from anything a modern person has encountered that it constitutes its own form of culture shock. And culture shock that hits you through your nose before you've even had time to process anything. Visual is particularly disorienting. We established at the beginning of this video that Rome smelled. We described it as a smell of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary unpleasantness. Now let's be specific about what the components of that smell were, because specificity is where the reality lives, and the reality is genuinely instructive about what daily life in this city was like. Start with the animals. Rome, in 100 AD, had animals everywhere. Not just the livestock of the food production system, not just the horses and mules, and oxen of the transport network, but the animals that were simply a constant feature of urban life in a world before mechanized transport. The horses that pulled carts, the mules that carried loads through the streets, the oxen in the markets, the dogs. Rome had a significant feral dog population, as most ancient cities did, living in the streets and alleys, scavenging from waste, howling at night, occasionally biting. The animals of the arena, the elephants, the lions, the bears, the hippopotamuses, the crocodiles held in enclosures beneath the Colosseum, and in Bavaria around the city, before their appearance in the games. Animals produce waste continuously and without consideration for urban sanitation. In a city with 1 million people and a very large animal population, the animal waste on the streets was a constant feature of the sensory landscape, stepped in, tracked through, partially washed away by rain, and by the water flowing from the aqueduct overflow, and partially remaining. The street channel that we mentioned at the beginning was partly serving this function, directing animal and human waste toward the sewer outlets, but the channel's capacity was not infinite and its maintenance was not perfect. The garum production facilities, the workshops where fish sauce was fermented, were a specific and legendary source of olfactory distress. Garum was produced by packing fish with salt in large vessels and leaving them in the sun for months, allowing fermentation and liquefaction to proceed. This process produced a smell of such power and specificity that Roman cities periodically attempted to zone garum production facilities away from residential areas, with limited success because the production was widespread and the demand was enormous. The philosopher and politician Cassiodorus described the smell of garum production in terms that suggest it required some psychological preparation to approach. The tanneries, the facilities that processed animal hides into leather using a range of chemicals including urine and animal brains and various plant tannins, were another significant contributor to Rome's olfactory landscape. The tanning process produces distinctive smells that modern people who have encountered traditional tanneries, some of which are still in operation in cities like Fez in Morocco, describe as among the most intense urban smells they have encountered. Roman cities attempted, with more success than the garum problem, to locate tanneries in specific districts away from residential areas, but in a city as densely built as Rome, the distance between tannery district and residential area was limited. The fullers, the workers who processed newly woven cloth by treading it in large vats of water mixed with urine, which provided the alkaline chemistry needed to clean and felt the wool fibers, operated workshops throughout the city. Urine for the fulling vats was collected from public streets, large vessels placed at street corners specifically for passers-by to urinate into. The contents periodically collected by fullers who paid the emperor a tax for the privilege. The emperor Vespasian, when criticized for taxing urine, famously held a gold coin to his son Titus's nose and asked whether it smelled, and his son said no, and Vespasian said, "And yet it comes from urine and from the public toilets." The smell of a foolery in operation was specific, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. The open-air food markets, the fish market, the meat market, the vegetable market, each had their own olfactory contributions. The fish market in particular, in a Mediterranean climate where fish decomposed rapidly and where ice was a luxury available only to the very wealthy, operated in conditions that required specific cultural adaptation to experience without distress. Roman satirists complained about the fish market. Roman food writers praised specific fish, preparations, and noted that the best garum came from fish that were very fresh when processed, and that inferior garum came from fish that were not. The distance between very fresh and not very fresh in a Roman summer market was measured in hours. The dead. Ancient Rome had laws requiring burial outside the city limits. The Lex Julia Municipalis prohibited burial within the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. The major roads leading out of Rome were lined with tombs on both sides, which is why archaeological exploration of Roman roads outside city boundaries consistently reveals tombs. But within the city, compliance with burial laws was imperfect among the poor, and the bodies of those who could not afford proper burial sometimes ended up in disposal pits. The Puticuli on the Esquiline Hill are a documented example. Mass graves for the bodies of the very poor that were used until Augustus had them filled over and built gardens above them. The smell of death in a city of 1 million people with high mortality rates and imperfect burial practices was not merely theoretical. Rome smelled of the dead as well as the living, the sulfur from the metalworking furnaces and the lime kilns that operated throughout the city, the wood smoke from 1 million cooking and heating fires, the smell of the perfumes and unguents that wealthy Romans applied liberally to counter the ambient smell of everything else. All of these layers combined to produce the specific olfactory environment of ancient Rome, which was unlike anything in the modern world. The closest modern analogy might be the combination of a large livestock market, a fish processing facility, a traditional tannery, a large bonfire, and the background baseline of a densely populated urban environment without modern waste management. Layered together, experienced continuously, it was an environment that required genuine acclimatization, that Romans who had grown up in the city had adapted to over lifetimes, and that newcomers found overwhelming. Your nose, accustomed to the relatively low-intensity olfactory environment of a modern city, is going to find Rome genuinely challenging. Not just unpleasant, challenging in the sense of producing a physical stress response that affects your ability to concentrate on anything else until you have spent enough time in the environment that your brain has been forced to accept it as the new normal. The noise deserves equal time because Rome was not merely smelly, it was extraordinarily loud. The ban on wheeled vehicles during daylight hours, which we have already discussed, meant that the night was filled with the sound of iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement, a sound that if you have ever heard a large cart on cobblestones, you know is not a subtle one. It is a sound that penetrates walls, that carries for significant distances, that is impossible to sleep through, unless you have the kind of deep habituation that comes from sleeping next to it your entire life. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius that is one of the most vivid descriptions of urban noise in all of ancient literature. He was living, he says, directly above a bathhouse, and the sounds that came up through the floor included the grunting of weightlifters, the sound of someone being massaged having their back slapped, the splashing of people jumping into the pool, the quarreling of people who got into arguments while bathing, the hair removal specialist announcing his services. Hair removal in Roman baths was performed by attendants who either plucked or used depilatory preparations, and the customer's vocal reaction to plucking was apparently audible through multiple floors of stone construction. The various vendors who circulated through the baths selling refreshments. And outside the baths, he adds, there are the carts, the construction workers, the religious, processions with their music, and the man in the street who is performing some kind of sustained vocal activity that Seneca found impossible to characterize, precisely but deeply objectionable. This letter, written approximately 2,000 years ago, has the emotional authenticity of a noise complaint filed yesterday. Seneca's irritation is entirely legible, his descriptions are entirely plausible. And the noise environment he describes was, apparently, so constant and so intense that even a Stoic philosopher, someone whose philosophical tradition emphasized the ability to remain undisturbed by external circumstances, felt moved to write about it at length. The construction noise was a specific category worth noting. Rome was, throughout the imperial period, a city under perpetual construction. The insulae that were always burning or collapsing needed constant rebuilding. The great imperial monuments, the forums, the temples, the baths, the aqueducts, were constantly being built, expanded, or repaired. The Trajan's Column, the Trajan's Market, the Baths of Trajan, all of these were being constructed in roughly the period we're discussing, which meant that large sections of Rome were active construction sites, with all the noise, stone cutting, hammering, shouting of workers, creaking of lifting equipment, and all the hazard, falling material, collapsing scaffolding, wayward carts loaded with building materials that entails. The noise of the crowd was its own category. A city of 1 million people conducting their daily life produces a continuous ambient roar of human vocal activity. Conversation, argument, transaction, the cries of street vendors, the noise of children, the sounds of the various trades being conducted in the street, that has no modern analog except perhaps in the densest and most chaotic urban markets of the modern world. Times Square is large and loud. The Grand Bazaar in Istanbul is large and loud. Neither approaches the sustained ambient noise level of a city of 1 million people living and working in close proximity, conducting most of their daily social and economic life outdoors because their homes are too small and too dark to do much in, with no sound insulation between them and the street. The heat deserves mention because Rome's climate, a Mediterranean climate with hot, dry summers, combined with the urban heat island effect produced by 1 million bodies and 1 million fires, and the thermal mass of the stone buildings to create summer temperatures in the city that were genuinely extreme. Rome in August is hot by modern standards. Rome in August in 100 AD, in the middle of the city, surrounded by stone buildings that had been absorbing heat all day, was worse. The wealthy escaped to their country villas. The practice of villeggiatura, the summer retreat from the city, was a recognized feature of the Roman aristocratic calendar. The poor stayed in the city, in their insulae, in the heat, and dealt with it. The light, or rather the absence of it, was another sensory feature that distinguishes the Roman experience from the modern. We have mentioned the darkness of winter inside the insula, but even in summer, in daylight, the interior of a Roman building was considerably darker than a modern building because the windows were small. Large windows in a Roman insula were a structural and thermal liability because glass windows were rare in ordinary buildings and translucent rather than transparent even where they existed, and because the ratio of interior space to window area was low by modern standards. The Roman day was therefore organized differently in relation to light than the modern day. The first light of dawn was the signal for the beginning of active life. The morning was the most productive period, when natural light was good and before the heat of the day became debilitating. The early afternoon, the midday hours, was for rest. The siesta that Mediterranean cultures have maintained into the modern period is a genuine climatic adaptation, not merely a cultural preference. The evening light, such as it was before the torches and the braziers came out, marked the transition to the social activities of the late day. There is one final sensory dimension that is almost never addressed in popular accounts of ancient Rome: touch. Specifically, the texture of the Roman physical environment as experienced by the human body in contact with it. The stone streets were hard and uneven, and in certain conditions, slippery. The surfaces of public buildings, marble, stone, concrete, were cold in winter, hot in summer, and offered no give under contact. The benches of the theater and the amphitheater were stone, without cushioning, which meant that a multi-hour entertainment event required either a personal cushion, wealthy Romans brought them, or the development of a tolerance for sitting on stone for extended periods. The straw mattresses of ordinary sleeping accommodation were rough, and inhabited by various small organisms. The wool clothing of everyday Roman life was scratchy in its less refined versions. The Roman experience was a physically engaged experience, in a way that is simply different from the modern experience of urban life, where an enormous amount of effort has gone into creating smooth, soft, temperature-controlled surfaces that minimize the body's awareness of its physical environment. Rome gave you its physical environment directly, without mediation, in the full sensory intensity of stone, and heat, and cold, and smell, and noise. You are now, at the end of your day, a person who has been fully physically present in ancient Rome. Not as a tourist looking at ruins, not as a reader imagining the scene from a comfortable chair, but as a body moving through a physical environment that was engaging every one of your senses simultaneously and continuously for the entire day. You're exhausted in a way that you probably haven't been exhausted since the last time you did genuinely sustained physical work in genuinely difficult conditions. You smell. You're probably experiencing some degree of gastrointestinal complaint. Your feet hurt from the stone streets. Your ears are ringing from the sustained ambient noise. Your eyes have been working hard in variable and often inadequate light. Your nose has been processing an olfactory environment of unprecedented complexity. You have survived the day. Whether you survive the night is a different question. Chapter 8: Fire, Flood, and Plague. The disasters that shaped the city. Individual, daily hazards are one thing, but Rome was also subject to a class of collective disasters. City-scale catastrophes that struck without warning, moved faster than individual response could manage, and killed not individual unlucky people, but thousands at a time. Let's talk about the big ones. Fire we have already discussed in the context of the insulae, but the scale of Roman fire disasters deserves separate attention. The Great Fire of 64 AD, the one traditionally, and probably incorrectly, associated with Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned, is the most famous, but it was not an isolated event. Rome burned in 80 AD. It burned in 191 AD under Commodus. It burned repeatedly in the years between, in smaller but still significant events. The city was rebuilt after each of these fires with genuine speed. The Roman capacity for rapid construction was remarkable, but the rebuilt city retained many of the same structural vulnerabilities that had made the fire possible in the first place, because the economics of urban land in Rome drove the same rapid, cheap, tall construction that the previous fire had destroyed. The firefighting capacity of Rome was genuine but limited. The vigiles, the freedmen firefighters established by Augustus, were organized into cohorts stationed throughout the city's regions, equipped with hand pumps, buckets, axes, and hooks for pulling down adjacent structures to create fire breaks. They were trained, organized, and responsive. They were also dealing with fires in a city where the buildings were made of wood and fired clay, and where narrow streets made it difficult to bring equipment close to the blaze, where the water pressure from the aqueduct system was not designed to supply firefighting hoses, and where the speed of fire spread through densely packed wooden upper stories was faster than manual firefighting techniques could realistically contain. The Great Fires were not just urban disasters in the physical sense. They were social catastrophes that displaced enormous numbers of people simultaneously, throwing thousands of families into homelessness, destroying businesses and livelihoods, disrupting the social networks and neighborhood communities that were the basic unit of Roman urban social life. The aftermath of a major fire required the kind of organized emergency response that Rome was not always well equipped to provide, and the political dimension of disaster response. The emperor's obligation to demonstrate generosity in crisis, the political cost of being seen as inadequate in response, was as real in ancient Rome as it is in modern disaster politics. The flood was the other recurring physical catastrophe. The Tiber River, which flowed through Rome and which was essential to the city's commercial and logistical function as the conduit through which goods arrived from Ostia, flooded regularly. The low-lying areas of Rome, the valleys between the hills, the districts near the river, were subject to inundation in the flood season, and the historical record contains enough references to significant Tiber floods to make it clear this was a persistent urban problem rather than a rare, exceptional event. A Tiber flood in Rome had immediate and dramatic consequences. The streets of the flooded districts filled with water, which was itself a mixture of river water and the backflow from the sewer system. The Cloaca Maxima, when the Tiber was high, could not drain normally, and its contents reversed into the city streets. The flooded districts became temporarily uninhabitable. Ground floor commercial premises were destroyed. Food stores were ruined. The logistics of a city that depended on river transport were disrupted at exactly the moment when the disruption was most costly. The aftermath of flooding added the contamination problem to the physical damage. Floodwaters that have flowed through a city's streets, mixing with sewer overflow and the full range of urban waste, deposit that contamination as they recede. The waterlogged lower floors of buildings, the stone and concrete that absorbed and retained moisture, became environments in which mold and other organisms thrived. The water sources that served neighborhoods near the river could be contaminated in ways that were not immediately apparent. The post-flood period in Rome's low-lying districts was a period of elevated disease risk on top of the physical destruction. The emperors spent significant administrative energy on flood management. Augustus installed a permanent board, the Curatores Reparum et Alveae Tiberis, specifically charged with managing the Tiber's banks and channel to reduce flood risk. Various emperors undertook engineering projects intended to reduce flooding. None of these efforts eliminated the problem, because the Tiber's flood behavior was determined by upstream catchment conditions that were beyond the city's control, and the engineering solutions available to Rome, while impressive, were not sufficient to fully manage a major river's flood behavior. The plague was the most lethal of Rome's periodic collective disasters, and the Roman Empire's connectivity, the trade networks, the roads, the military movements that knit together a territory spanning millions of square kilometers, made it simultaneously the most efficient plague-spreading infrastructure that had yet existed, and a first-class demonstration of why being the center of a connected world has specific epidemiological consequences. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, arriving in Rome with soldiers returning from campaigns in the east, spreading through the army, and then through the civilian population along the same roads and trade routes that connected the empire, is estimated to have killed between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman Empire over its 15-year duration. It may have been smallpox. It may have been measles. The contemporary descriptions by Galen, who was in Rome when it arrived, and who wrote detailed clinical descriptions of the disease's symptoms and progression, are consistent with one or both of these diagnoses. Smallpox and measles are viral diseases for which no ancient world population had established immunity, because both appear to have been relatively new zoonotic diseases that had recently crossed from animal reservoirs into human populations. And the Roman Empire, with its massive and mobile population, was an ideal environment for their establishment and spread. A population with no prior immunity encountering these diseases for the first time experienced them as they were, as devastating killers with case fatality rates that decimated communities. The Antonine Plague struck before our specific 100 AD setting, but it represents a category of disaster that was always possible, that the Roman world's connectivity and density made not just possible, but periodic. And the Antonine Plague was followed by the Plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century, and the Justinianic Plague of the 6th century, bubonic plague with its specific and recognizable clinical features described in contemporary sources, and the general pattern of epidemic disease that made the Roman world both commercially connected and epidemiologically vulnerable. The specific vulnerability of dense urban populations to epidemic disease is one of the clearest lessons of epidemiology. People in close proximity share their pathogens as readily as they share their trade goods, their culture, and their political institutions. Rome was the most densely populated city in the Western world for several centuries, and it paid the epidemiological price for that density. Your specific risk from epidemic disease during your day in Rome depends on timing, whether you arrive during an epidemic or not, and on your existing immune status. If you have been vaccinated against smallpox, a vaccine that was still routinely administered until the 1970s, you have some protection against the Antonine Plague, if that's what it was. If you haven't been vaccinated, you are in the same position as the immunologically naive Roman population encountering it for the first time, against the full range of bacterial diseases that were endemic in Rome. Typhoid fever, which spreads through contaminated food and water. Dysentery, which spreads similarly. Cholera, which spreads through contaminated water. You have no specific protection beyond the general immunological competence that modern childhood vaccination has built, which provides some baseline resistance but not specific protection. The intersection of the plague with Roman medical practice was particularly unfortunate. A Galenic physician treating a patient with smallpox or measles would apply humoral medicine, bloodletting to reduce the heat and blood humor, purging to expel the corrupt humors, and these interventions would weaken a patient who was already severely physiologically stressed by a high fever viral illness. Galen himself fled Rome for his home in Pergamon during the initial outbreak of the Antonine Plague, citing the need to attend to his medical duties in his home region. Decision that his subsequent reputation for courage and dedication perhaps required some retrospective explanation. The Roman religious response to plague was to propitiate the gods who were perceived as causing or permitting it. Large-scale sacrifices, prayers, processions, appeals to specific deities associated with healing, Apollo, Aesculapius, and to attempt to identify any ritual failures that might have caused divine displeasure. This response was psychologically coherent within the Roman religious framework, provided social solidarity and a sense of collective action, and had no effect on the epidemic's actual progression. The plague ran its course when it ran its course, killing approximately what biology determined it would kill before the combination of population immunity and pathogen evolution produced an equilibrium. The physical marks of Rome's fire and flood and plague history were visible in the city's built environment throughout the imperial period. The rebuilt districts after major fires, the flood marks on buildings in the low-lying areas, the temples and altars dedicated during plagues as acts of propitiation. The city carried its disaster history in its stones, and the Romans who walked through it daily were walking through a landscape that was, in its accumulated monuments, and its rebuilt streets, and its dedicated altars, a record of how many times this city had been devastated and had rebuilt itself. This resilience was genuinely impressive. Rome survived the Great Fire. It survived the Antonine Plague. It survived floods that would have been the end of less tenacious cities. The combination of imperial resources, logistical infrastructure, and the sheer demographic mass of a million-person city gave Rome a regenerative capacity that smaller cities lacked. But every recovery left scars, and the cumulative effect of repeated disasters on the city's social fabric, its economic resources, and its population's health was real and significant. Chapter 9. What Rome got right. The genuinely impressive parts that almost make up for everything else. We have spent a considerable amount of this video cataloging the ways in which ancient Rome was trying to kill you. We have been accurate. The hazards we've described were real. The mortality they produced was real, and the gap between the conditions of daily life in 100 AD Rome and the conditions that modern people have come to consider normal is genuinely large. But here is the thing: Rome was, by the standards of its time and place, extraordinary. Not just impressive in the way that all great civilizations are impressive when viewed from sufficient historical distance. Genuinely, substantively, technically extraordinary in ways that had direct positive effects on the lives of the people who lived in it. and in ways that influenced the development of the Western world so profoundly that their influence is still visible in the specific institutions and infrastructure of modern life. Let's give Rome its due. The aqueducts first, because they are the most immediately relevant to the daily life we've been discussing, and because they represent an engineering achievement that deserves genuine admiration. Rome was supplied by 11 major aqueducts by the time of the later imperial period, collectively delivering roughly 1 million cubic meters of water per day, approximately 300 gallons per person for a population of 1 million. This was more water per capita than many modern cities deliver, and it was delivered through gravity-fed systems that required no pumping. The aqueducts used the topography of the Italian landscape to maintain a continuous gentle gradient from the water source to the city, keeping the water flowing continuously without mechanical intervention. The engineering of these systems, the surveying needed to maintain the precise gradients over distances of tens of kilometers, the construction of the arcaded sections that carried the aqueduct over valleys, the distribution systems within the city that directed water to fountains and to private connections, was a genuine intellectual and technical achievement. The water delivered was genuinely clean, drawn from spring sources or from rivers above the city, transported in covered channels that prevented contamination, delivered continuously so that the standing time in which bacterial growth could occur was minimized. The free public access to this water, the fountains distributed throughout the city's neighborhoods, available to anyone without charge, running continuously, was a public health policy of genuine benefit. Whatever the other problems of Rome's sanitation environment, the availability of clean drinking water at public fountains was a real advantage over cities that depended on wells or local water sources that were more easily contaminated. The roads, the Roman road network, which at its height extended to roughly 400,000 kilometers of roads throughout the empire, of which approximately 80,000 kilometers were paved stone military roads, was an engineering and administrative achievement that had no parallel in the ancient world. The famous phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was almost literally true. The road network was organized radially from Rome, with major roads extending to every corner of the empire, and the infrastructure of the road system, the milestones, the road stations, the bridges, the standardized construction specifications, created a connectivity that made the Roman Empire function as an integrated unit rather than a collection of disconnected regions. The direct effects on daily life of this road network included the ability to move goods, people, and military forces with a speed and reliability that was unprecedented. Food from North Africa reached Rome reliably enough to support a population that could not feed itself from its local agricultural resources. Military force could be moved to the frontier faster than any enemy could expect. Legal and administrative communications flowed through the empire with a regularity that allowed centralized governance of a territory of extraordinary size. The road technology itself, the layered construction using gravel, sand, and fitted stone that produced a durable, well-drained surface, was sophisticated enough that Roman roads have served as the foundation for modern roads in some regions, and the road-building principles the Romans developed informed road construction for centuries after their time. The legal system deserves specific acknowledgement, despite everything we've said about its differential treatment of social classes and its various injustices, because the corpus of Roman law, the accumulated legal thinking of centuries of jurists codified in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the 6th century, is one of the great intellectual achievements of Western civilization and the direct ancestor of most modern Western legal systems. The Roman legal tradition developed concepts that remain fundamental to modern law: the distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personhood, the presumption of innocence. Innocent until proven guilty is a Roman principle. The distinction between intent and action in the assessment of criminal responsibility. The concept of property rights and their legal protection, contract law, and its enforceability. The specific technical sophistication of Roman legal analysis, the precision with which jurists distinguished between similar cases, the logical rigor of legal reasoning, produced a body of thought that could be, and was, applied to the radically different circumstances of medieval and modern Europe with sufficient flexibility to remain useful. When modern legal systems in Europe and in countries influenced by European legal tradition use concepts like possession, contract, tort, inheritance, property rights, and corporate personality, they are using concepts developed and refined by Roman legal thinkers over several centuries. The Roman lawyer who argued a property case before a Roman magistrate and the modern lawyer arguing a property case before a modern court are, through this lineage, participants in the same intellectual tradition. The Roman literary and philosophical tradition produced work that has genuinely endured. Virgil's Aeneid is not merely a historical document. It is a poem of genuine beauty and genuine power that has been read, translated, imitated, and drawn upon for 2,000 years. Cicero's political and philosophical writings established a Latin prose style and a mode of philosophical inquiry that shaped the development of Western thought through the Renaissance and beyond. Seneca's Stoic philosophy, the letter about the bath noise and everything else, has been read by everyone from medieval monks to modern executives looking for ancient wisdom about managing stress. Ovid's poetry about love and transformation has informed Western literature so pervasively that its influence is impossible to fully catalog. These were not works produced despite Rome's conditions, but partly through them, through the specific combination of political turbulence and personal experience that Virgil wrote through the legal and political career that gave Cicero both his subject matter and his rhetorical training, through the court life and exile and eventual execution that sharpened Seneca's thinking about what truly mattered. The literature of Rome is inseparable from the life of Rome, and both its achievements and its darkness are present in the works that survive. The engineering achievements beyond the aqueducts deserve mention. The Pantheon, whose unreinforced concrete dome, 43 meters in diameter, remained the largest dome in the world for over a millennium after its construction, was not just a demonstration of technical capability, but an architectural space of genuine spiritual power that is still experienced as remarkable by the millions of people who visit it annually. The Roman arch and vault, structural innovations that allowed the spanning of large spaces in stone and concrete, made possible a scale and variety of architecture that had not previously existed and that defined European architectural ambition for centuries. The system of public baths, despite the microbiological issues we have discussed, was a genuine public welfare achievement. Access to bathing facilities, social gathering spaces, and recreational amenities was provided to Rome's entire free population at nominal cost, and the social function of the baths, the space where the rigid social hierarchy of Roman daily life was partially suspended, where people from different social backgrounds encountered each other in a common human activity, was genuinely valuable. The modern analogy is the public library or the public park, a space that belongs to everyone and that serves functions beyond its stated purpose. The Roman concept of public space more broadly, the piazzas, the forums, the gardens, the colonnaded walkways that provided shelter and social space in the city, was a contribution to urban design that has influenced city planning ever since. The idea that a city has an obligation to provide its citizens with spaces that are neither commercial nor private, that exist for the benefit of the community as a whole, is a Roman idea that has been continuously influential in Western urban design. The Roman Empire's management of a diverse, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious population across a territory of extraordinary size was a genuine political achievement, and the specific mechanisms through which it was accomplished, the extension of citizenship, the integration of local elites into the Roman administrative system, the Relative tolerance of local religious and cultural practices within the framework of Roman imperial loyalty produced a period of relative stability and prosperity across a large portion of the Western world that was not replicated for many centuries after Rome's fall. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the period from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, in which the Mediterranean world experienced a relatively long period without major interstate warfare, was not peaceful in any absolute sense. There were border wars, internal revolts, civic violence, and the constant background violence of a slave-based society, but it was peaceful enough by the standards of what preceded and followed it to represent a genuine improvement in the conditions of life for a large number of people. The urbanization that Rome drove, the spread of city life, city infrastructure, and city culture across the provinces of the empire, brought aqueducts and forums and bathhouses and roads and the legal infrastructure of Roman civic life to populations that had not previously had access to these things. The Roman city, reproduced from Britain to Syria, was an institution of genuine benefit in multiple respects, however imperfect its specific implementations. And there is, finally, the sheer audacity of the project. Rome's ambition to build a city that could house 1 million people, to construct roads that connected the known world, to codify laws that could govern a civilization, to build monuments that expressed the full reach of human aspiration, was an ambition that has shaped the Western imagination about what civilization can be and what it can do ever since. We are still, in various ways, living in Rome's shadow, in its legal tradition, in its architectural vocabulary, in its literary inheritance, in the specific shape of the Western political imagination, which makes the honest accounting of what Rome was, the smell, and the noise, and the social hierarchy, and the bad medicine, and the fire risk, and the food poisoning, and the lead pipes, not a debunking of Rome's greatness, but a necessary complication of it. The greatness was real. The difficulty was also real. Both were present in the same city, in the same streets, on the same day. Conclusion: getting out. Evening in Rome. The light is failing. The last of the day's street vendors are packing up. The cart traffic has resumed, the iron-rimmed wheels producing the noise that Juvenal complained about, and that will continue until dawn. The baths are still open. They operate late by lamplight, the social activity continuing long after the sun has gone down. You have made it through the day. Against the statistical odds that a realistic assessment of the environment would suggest, you are still alive, ambulatory, and possessed of sufficient cognitive function to reflect on what you've experienced. Let's take stock. You have walked streets that were actively hazardous in, at least 5 distinct ways: falling objects, vehicle traffic, uneven pavement, criminal activity, and the ambient microbiological environment. And you have not been killed by any of them, though the microbiological environment's full effects may not have manifested yet. You have eaten food from a thermopolium that has been warm all morning, drunk wine that may contain trace amounts of lead, and breathed air that contains the respiratory output of 1 million people in various states of health. You have navigated the social hierarchy of the most status-conscious society in the ancient world without making an error serious enough to result in immediate physical or legal consequences, though you have almost certainly made errors whose social costs you're not yet aware of. You have watched entertainment that required psychological recalibration in ways that you're still processing, in physical conditions, stone seats, Mediterranean heat, crowds of thousands that were physically demanding. You have encountered the Roman legal system in the abstract and understood, at least theoretically, how many different ways you could accidentally have made your situation worse. You have experienced Rome through all 5 senses at once, in their full, unmediated intensity, for an entire day. And here is what you understand now, at the end of this day, that you did not understand at the beginning. Rome's greatness and Rome's difficulty were not separate things. They were the same thing, viewed from different angles. The city that built the Pantheon and the aqueducts was the same city that was perpetually on fire and smelled of garum and animal waste, and the Tiber flood. The civilization that produced Virgil and Cicero and Galen and the 12 tables of Roman law was the same civilization that tortured slaves for testimony and beat poor citizens with rods and applied bloodletting to sick people who needed the opposite of bloodletting. The empire that connected the world with its roads and its commerce was the same empire that connected the world's diseases with devastating efficiency. Civilization is not a replacement for the fundamental difficulties of human existence. It is, at best, a management strategy, an attempt to organize collective resources, knowledge, and effort in ways that reduce the worst outcomes and enable some people, some of the time, to live lives of genuine quality. Rome was one of history's more ambitious management strategies, and it worked, in specific respects, for specific populations, better than anything that had come before it, and better than much of what came after it for several centuries. It also had its limitations, its injustices, its systematic failures, and its specific ways of killing people that had nothing to do with enemy armies or natural disaster, but were simply features of the daily environment. You wouldn't last a day in ancient Rome, not because ancient Romans were tougher than you. They were, in the sense that they had adapted to their environment in ways you haven't, but that adaptation was the product of years of exposure and habituation, not innate superiority. You wouldn't last because the specific combination of hazards that Rome presented was calibrated to a population that had developed specific resistances, specific knowledge, specific social resources for dealing with it. You are not that population. You are a modern person, formed by modern conditions, immunologically and psychologically and socially adapted to the specific hazards of the modern world, rather than the ancient one. You have been optimized by your environment for your environment. Rome's environment would find the gaps in that optimization almost immediately. And yet, and this is the genuinely surprising thing about spending a day in ancient Rome, in your imagination, you would not want to have missed it, because the city that is also trying to kill you is also genuinely, breathtakingly alive in a way that is difficult to match. The noise and the smell and the danger are inseparable from the energy, the vitality, the sheer dense human presence of 1 million people living their lives with intensity in the most important city in the Western world. The social complexity that makes every interaction a potential minefield also makes every interaction genuinely significant, weighted with meaning and stakes in ways that the smoothed, mediated, comfort-optimized interactions of modern life rarely achieve. The food is genuinely interesting when it's not poisoning you. The architecture is genuinely magnificent when it's not on fire. The philosophy is genuinely profound, even when the physician applying it is making you sicker. The entertainment is genuinely visceral and engaging, even when it's disturbing. Rome is a city worth surviving if you can manage it. The question is whether you can manage it. Given everything we've discussed today, the odds are against you, but they were against most Romans too, and most of them managed anyway, through some combination of adaptation and stubbornness, and community and luck. That is, in its own way, one of the most impressive things about the human species. You just need a bit more time, and perhaps a better physician, and definitely a ground floor room.